The Republic, Book 4. Book 4 will turn out to be an exciting book because Socrates returns to the original analogy of the Republic. We've done so much utopia building that we forgot perhaps why we were building the utopia in the first place. We are not interested in the ideal society for the sake of itself. We are interested in the ideal society because it gives us insight into the ideal psychology. Remember back from Book 2, Socrates says that society is nothing but a projection of the human psyche. So that if we could build the perfect society, we would already have given the blueprint for the perfect psyche, the most just. Once we have that blueprint, we're hoping to be able to define what justice is psychologically, and then compare that guy's mind to the mind of the most unjust person to see which is happier. This takes place in Book 4. Okay. At the beginning of Book 4, Socrates argues that the guardians must keep a watchful eye that neither extreme wealth nor extreme poverty enter into the city. Obviously, he's a strong proponent of the middle class. The argument, and this, we're talking about the bronzes now, remember, because the silvers and golds don't get to have any money anyways. So this is exclusive for the bronze class. And this is everybody who's not in the military or who's not a lawmaker. Now, what happens when the doctor becomes too rich or the carpenter becomes too rich? The idea is that they'll stop doing their job. And their job will be filled by the second guy in line. And the moment you say that that guy's second, that means that there's somebody sitting at the community table who is not the best candidate for that job, which diminishes the idea of the perfect society for everyone else. So we don't want them growing so wealthy that they get lazy and stop going to work. This will diminish the quality of life for everyone, eventually them too. At the same time, we don't want them to be too poor, because if the doctor can't afford an autoclave or the carpenter can't afford buying sharp circular saw bits, I think the idea is that you have to pay them enough to be able to maintain their shop. And if you don't, they'll start cutting corners. And when you start cutting corners on like sterilizing instruments, then that affects job productivity. When a carpenter starts using less expensive materials, that actually affects productivity. So we can't pay them too much for fear they'll stop working, and we can't pay them so little that they can't work. The idea is to pay them somewhere in between. Not everyone would earn the same thing. Nobody's saying that doctor and carpenter should equal or earn the exact same amount of money. We're simply saying pay them proportionate to their good, but not so much that they can't, or not so much that they stop, nor so little that they can't do it. That's interesting. Adeimantus starts harassing him about how this country where there is an extreme wealth and poverty could possibly protect itself if attacked or attacked anyone else. Socrates has an interesting response that this is a unified country. Unlike countries where there are extreme wealth and poverty, you would actually have a country with two parts, the rich and the poor. And those countries can be easily defeated by causing internal civil strife. So he argues that in the case of the Republic, they would not have a hard time finding allies, nor would they have a hard time defeating most enemies, because their battle-hardened guardians will make quick work of citizen soldiers who do not practice the principal specialization elsewhere. Okay. He places certain limitations on the size of the city. How large does Socrates believe a city can grow? This is a great passage. He says, so they can grow as big as they can, so long as they stay unified. So long as they stay one social organism that's all of its parts are mutually dependent. That is the claim. Any larger than that, it starts to be unhealthy. Any smaller than that, and they're on their way up. But they can keep expanding until they get to the point where any more people generates social divisions that lead to long-term decline. Now, he does say some weird things about marriage and having children that we're going to come back to in Book 5. For the time being, realize the Bronzes can have private families, but the Guardians can't. So he's going to argue that the private family represents a threat to objectivity for the Guardian class. It's sort of like saying there's a reason why Anakin Skywalker was not supposed to engage in sexual relations with Natalie Portman in the Star Wars movies, with Padme, because there's something about the private interest, that threatens the objectivity of the Guardians of the Republic. Okay. Excuse me. So, there's been some pretty radical policies. Censorship, medical injunctions, no private property for the Guardians, no extreme wealth or property for the Bronzes. These are some pretty basic laws. It's not a vast legal code. And he thinks from these basic laws that his city can be self-sustaining and self-perpetuating. He then goes on to say that vast legal codes are symptomatic of social decline. If education is done right, citizens will have the common sense not to, these are my quotation marks, but not to pour oil down the gutter. Because they will understand that the social organism is comprised of distinct parts that are mutually dependent upon one another. The only reason anybody in our country can pour oil down their own gutter is because they don't understand the causal relationships between the gutter and the river and what comes to their own dinner plate, or their children's dinner plate at school. If people understood how we live in a kind of an ecosystem, they wouldn't do half the things that they do. So the fact that people pour oil down the gutter, and the fact that we need a law for it, suggests that people are poorly educated. He thinks if you do education right, both healthcare cost, criminal justice cost, and just vast legal codes will all be diminished if properly educated. Okay. Now, what we're about to talk about begins the most important part of the book so far. It's where we start to see his answer. As I stated at the beginning of this recording, he is somewhat interested in social politics and what have you, but his construction and development of society is only a means to an end, to be able to generate a description of the perfect psychology. And this is what we're about to do right now. So he says that there are 4 virtues or qualities or excellences that make his city good and his psychology good, or the soul good. Remember, the word psyche in Greek can mean soul. That's its first meaning. So the city is good that possesses wisdom, bravery, temperance, and justice. So too will the soul be that is wise, brave, temperate, and just. In Book 4, he defines these virtues socially, and then applies the social definition to psychology to generate a personal definition of wisdom, bravery, temperance, and justice. But first, he divided the city into 3 basic parts. You've got your golds, your silvers, and your bronzes. He didn't make these divisions up. He argues that any mature society will naturally form these 3 classes. There will be workers, there will be a need for the military, and then out of the military comes the need for good laws. Now, going back to Book 2, we said that society is nothing but a reflection of the human psyche. So if society has 3 parts, the human soul and psyche will also have 3 parts. What's neat about this is that the parts align. So what the golds are to the city, Socrates says, the rational element of the soul is to the mind. Now, the golds were supposed to rule the city for the city's well-being. The rational is supposed to rule the soul for the soul's well-being. This is the part of us that seeks knowledge, the part of us that is capable of wisdom. So what did the silvers do in the city? Well, they enforced the edicts and laws of the golds. Likewise, what he calls the high spirit is supposed to enforce the commands of the rational element with respect to personal psychology. The high spirit, he says, is the part of you that feels pride, the part of you that hates shame, and a part of you that desires honor. Now, I think you can see why the silvers coincide with the high spirit. The silvers represent our military, ambitious, honor-driven individuals. Likewise, the human high spirit reflects the part of my psychology that pursues honor, that hates shame. Okay, finally, you have the appetitive element of the soul. This is the part of human psychology that desires all of the things the bronze produce. So anything you can buy at the mall, for example, corresponds to a human appetite. Now, if any of you have taken psychology, you've probably heard of Sigmund Freud, the three-part psyche, right? The ego, the superego, and the id. Freud got his own psychology from what you're looking at right now on your screen. The rational element, Freud argued, was the ego. The high spirit will be socially constructed, and it'll become the superego. And the id represents all of our subconscious desires, the more baser ones. So although Freud changes and tweaks the terminology, in a way, his own advancements in psychology were a direct result of Plato. Plato is trying to define a psychologically just person to compare that person's life to the unjust. Freud, as far as I know, never tried to define virtue in terms of psychology, but Socrates will. Okay, 3 parts of the soul: rational, high spirit, appetitive, and every human being on this planet has all 3 parts, even though we don't always structure those parts in the exact same way. So, wisdom. In the city, civic wisdom is with the Golds, and it consists in the knowledge of how all parts of the city are connected to each other, with the ultimate purpose of keeping the city operating at its highest level. Knowledge of how the parts relate to one another, and thus how each affects another if altered, is key to the health of the city and is the defining characteristic of civic wisdom. Go back to the idea of the community table. You've got all these different guys sitting there: the farmer, the teacher, the doctor, the clothes maker, the artist. They all understand their own jobs, and they might understand how their job is related to the person who's sitting next to them, but the people who are sitting across the table from them, that they will not understand how those people's jobs are related to each other. Socrates says that you can't make laws for the well-being of the whole city unless you understand how each part of that city is causally related to each other part, about how there are threads that link education and criminal justice and health care, and how economics affects pretty much everything else. The idea is that to be a good coach of a football team, you can't just know one position. You need to know one position in its relation to other positions. How if the center's on a football team left ankle is hurt, how that might affect the wide receiver. Now why? Because if his ankle's hurt, the quarterback is most likely going to have to throw the ball a little bit faster, which means the receiver would need to get into position a little bit earlier. A good coach is one that could call the plays, knowing how each part is related to every other part, and what is the status in terms of each part at that given moment in time. He says that this is what civic wisdom is, and our lawmakers are able to do this, see the connections between the roles at the table. Now look what he does here. He defines wisdom socially, and then he applies that exact same definition to my psychology, or to human psychology. Personal wisdom is inside the rational part of the soul, and it consists in the knowledge of how all parts of the soul are connected to each other, with the ultimate purpose of keeping the soul as healthy and balanced as possible. Your psychology has a bunch of different drives, probably. Family, career, and let's just say golf. But what happens if I don't know the causal relationships and I just stop going to work to play golf all day? That's an unwise decision, since playing golf all day depends upon you going to work. You can't ever pursue a lesser psychological drive at the expense of a higher, because then both drives are destroyed. But you can only know the order and rank of your own psychology through reflection, through rational consciousness, through thinking back and saying, What are my priorities, and how can I make decisions to keep true to them?